Welcome back to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Graham Richmond, and joining me today is co-host Alex Brown. Alex, thanks for taking part again.
Thank you very much for having me again, Graham.
Yeah, and this is going to be our third edition of Wiretaps, which has been going really well in terms of the feedback we're getting on the website. And for those who are just tuning in for the first time, Wiretaps is a time where Alex and I sift through the entries coming in at clearadmit.com on the different wires that we have. So we have Livewire, Decision Wire, Apply Wire. And we sort of look at your entries in real time on the show here and talk about your candidacies. And for the last couple episodes, and I think we'll continue to do it today, we've been focusing on Apply Wire, which is a tool that people use at the beginning of the process to kind of just throw out their candidacy in terms of like, here's where I'm thinking of going to school or applying, and this is my background. What does everybody think? And so we're having a blast doing these, and so we're going to go through four very recent ApplyWire entries in today's episode, and also stay tuned at the end because we're going to talk a little bit about Livewire. And before we dive in, Alex, I did want to take like a second to sort of toot our own horn. I wanted to thank people who've been rating the podcast and writing reviews on iTunes. And so we got a review not so long ago that called the podcast a great listen. This person says they love the content that's put out. Good hosts, must not have been you and me, I guess. Good topics and good sound quality. And I should actually put in a shout out to our engineer and producer, John Pfeffer, because that's all his category. So thanks, John. And then the other person, the rest of this comment says, if you're interested in an MBA, what's not to like? So that was a great comment. And then another one that we had come across on iTunes says, very knowledgeable, with an exclamation point. This is a great podcast with very knowledgeable hosts. For anyone that is interested in pursuing an MBA, this is a podcast that you must listen to. So keep those reviews coming in, everyone. It really it warms Alex's and my heart to hear those little tidbits. And the other thing that's been great is as we've kicked off Wiretaps and have been actually looking at your entries on our website over the course of the podcast, folks have been actually chiming in on ApplyWire of late, saying that they've enjoyed these episodes. So thanks so much. We'll stop there and get into the fun stuff. And today, Alex, we have four candidates that we're going to look at. I'll give you guys the rundown. So our first candidate for Wiretaps is someone with a 780 on the GMAT. That's something you rarely see. A GPA of 3.58. This person has 2 years of work experience at present. Will have 3 by the time she matriculates. She revealed her gender, which helps us a little bit. Obviously, the more details you provide, the better. So she wants to start school in the fall of 2020. She's located in China, currently working in strategy consulting. Does not reveal the firm, but indicates that it's one of McKinsey, Bain, BCG. Post-MBA career is consulting, followed by venture capital. And she mentions in the notes, Asian female, may go back to pre-MBA firm after business school because of sponsorship, but long-term really wants to join the venture capital industry. And there were a few other notes, but Alex, let's just kind of dive in. What was your take on this? I know you had some dialogue with this candidate on the site. So what do you kind of think of this person's profile?
Yeah, I mean, I think basically this person has a very strong upside to her profile in terms of, going forward. She's clearly potential superstar in the making, I think. Strong numbers, 780 GMAT. I mean, that is extraordinary right there. Working for McKinsey, Bain, or BCG. Clearly, she must have done very well in college to get that situation. Those sorts of roles coming out of college are very difficult to acquire for anybody. I was a little concerned when I first responded to this candidate because I thought they were coming directly out of their analyst program with only 2 years' experience to start business school. And I felt that whilst that's doable, she may not maximize her opportunity in terms of getting into the very, very, very best. but it turns out that actually she'll be applying with 3 years of experience. So another year after the analyst program, she'll have that promotion under her, before she applies and so forth. So as long as she really nails the why now, and she does identify there's some personal reasons for this in one of her comments, but if she makes a really strong case for why now, and the realism of her goals going forward, which appears to include going back to her sponsoring company as an option, then she might well do very well. My question back to you, Graham, as I'm not exactly clear how realistic her long-term goal going into venture capital coming out of MBB.
I mean, I think it's doable. There are some hurdles, right? She's in China. I guess I'd love to know, does she want to work in VC in China, or is she kind of envisioning a move eventually to, the Valley or something? Because obviously some things would be harder than others to do, right? I think. But the nice thing about the Bain, BCG, and McKinsey networks is that they're really deep and strong, and they have, just as a top MBA program might, they have folks in VC and private equity. And so I would assume that a star performer at one of these firms post-MBA who kind of rises up in the ranks and then wants to go off and join a VC, that would be possible. Yeah. So I'm not so concerned about it. I guess the thing for me that stood out, a couple of things. Number one, should we have a policy on wiretaps? Like, should we... do you think it'd be better if folks put years of work experience at matriculation? Like, should we be more should we just ask for that? Because I think that does help us to know how many years of experience would you have when you start business school? Because that's really what the admissions team's kind of assessing you on. So anyway, just keeping that in mind, folks, as you post on the site. But I guess for me, like you said, she has the potential to be kind of a superstar candidate, 780 GMAT, 3.58, presumably from a decent institution in China if she ended up getting a job at MBB, right? So there's a lot to like here. The only thing I would say is that you look at the target schools and you've got, Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, MIT, and Kellogg. And I don't think I mentioned that at the outset. But so she's looking at the very, very top schools, as you would expect, right, for someone working at a top firm with top numbers. But, it's, as I think you said on the last episode of Wiretaps, Stanford and Harvard and, are kind of a reach for anybody, right? And so my view is that there's an ingredient that's missing at the moment from this candidate, and that is just like what's going to make her stand out from the crowd. And I think it won't take much. I mean, she's clearly qualified and has the right, ticks the boxes in terms of the numbers and things. But I do want to say there are other people applying to Stanford and Harvard and the like from McKinsey, Bain, and BCG. In fact, they're quite numerous. Now, not all of them will have a 780, but some of them may have, really great experiences, et cetera. So it'd be nice to sort of understand more about what makes this person tick and what might be an attribute or an interest or something in her profile that would help her to sort of jump off the page in terms of, this background and stuff.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I do think... a candidate like this, MBB, very strong numbers, should be going to a top school. My question is whether it's this year or next season or the following season, would they be stronger again? And they may have developed a little bit more sort of impact at work within an additional year. Maybe they've developed more of their outside of work activity. To show that they're a real impact person, which is what these very top schools are seeking. She may very well be able to show that now, as long as she then also nails the why now aspect of her plan. I think those two things are critical. The other aspect is if, let's say this candidate does apply this season and is not successful at these 5 schools, I think as long as she's patient as a reapplicant, she's going to get into one of these schools at some point as long as she continues an upward trajectory. So the idea of potentially throwing in 1 or 2 safety schools to assure admissions this season, unless she absolutely has to go to business school next year, I don't think I would follow that route simply because she is a younger candidate.
Yeah, I agree. I guess the one thing I would say is that I know increasingly schools are cognizant of, kind of, I guess, just circumstances that pertain mostly to the female, or really almost exclusively to the female portion of the applicant pool around like family planning, right? So that's something that as the schools have sought to get to sort of gender parity, they've recognized that there are a lot of women out there who want to get the MBA faster, and so that they can return to their current employer or start a new job and rise up in the ranks before having kids when they kind of lose some time potentially. So I think some of that could be at play because she mentions, personal reasons, and I mean, who knows, right? But it is, I think it does mean that an MBA admissions officer may be more likely to accept a younger female candidate today. So I'm not as worried, but I do think that, if she, the other thing that could happen is that if she just sort of comes in, look, I've got a 780, I'm at McKinsey or Bain or BCG, and, I'm going to go into VC, and there's no kind of soul to the story, that could play poorly, because I think there are a number of people working, and I've said this before, working at these firms that are kind of feeder firms who you sometimes wonder, like, are they doing the MBA because it's something they really feel they need, or are they doing it because it's sort of like the logical box to tick in their, given their kind of where they're working and stuff. So again, some passion and differentiation is all I think is needed in this candidacy to kind of really stand out. And as you said correctly, I don't think she needs a safety school. I think you're right. If she doesn't get in, she has time. She could reapply. And I wouldn't settle. So I think it makes sense. Anything else on her? Or should we move on to contestant number 2 on wiretaps here?
I think we could move on. I think in summary, she's potentially a great candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. And really appreciate her sharing the profile with us.
Yes.
So our second contestant on wiretaps or participant is a military officer from Singapore who has a 730 on the GMAT and a 385 GPA. He or she has been working for 6 years. They would like to end up in the U.S. targeting consulting and then maybe entrepreneurship. And the consulting companies they list are, surprise, surprise, Bain, BCG, and McKinsey. This person wants to start in the fall of 2020. And the list of target schools is, there's Berkeley, Harvard, INSEAD, MIT, Kellogg, Stanford, and Wharton. So all great programs. And we had some great dialogue with this candidate on the website. The other key piece that I just wanted to mention before I let you have at their candidacy is that they said that they're a member of the LGBT community, and they're seeking kind of a transition out of military in order to be able to live openly as a gay person, because it's still technically illegal to commit homosexual acts in Singapore. So they want to, kind of use the MBA as a real pivot point. But I just thought I'd mention that because LGBT, they've got a lot of just interesting ways to kind of connect with MBA communities out there because of that and because of the military angle. So I'll let you kind of speak to all of this, but what did you think of this person?
Yeah, I mean, I thought, again, this candidate's really very interesting. The military experience alone, combined with their numbers, 730 GMAT, 385 GPA from a military academy, would that in of itself would present potentially a very strong candidate. The fact that the candidate's also, dealt with these issues, related to his personal life and, being part of the LGBT community and so on and so forth, and wants to be a role model within that community going forward in the business world, I think is quite interesting. And clearly, it sounds like reading his or her profile, they have some stories to tell in terms of having to live not openly in the cultures that this person has navigated in the military and in Singapore. So it's probably some really interesting stories. As you said, they've got two avenues to reach out at these top schools that they're considering. They should be reaching out to the veterans clubs of each of the schools to make connections, as well as to the LGBT clubs of the schools to make those connections. Overall, I think a really potentially strong candidate. We know, for the most part, schools like military candidates. They have some really interesting leadership experiences, many of them, that parlays very well into the MBA application. There are some, make sure that they're able to sort of, good teamwork and various other things. It's all very good. So I think leadership or military tends to play well if it's executed well in the application. They want to go into short-term management consulting, which makes sense. My biggest criticism for this candidate was his or her long-term goal. I wanted to see a little bit more focus if there's a particular industry as such that they plan to go into to be that leader, that international leader, that cross-cultural leader that they talk about between Asia and the rest of the world and so forth. I think that's important. The candidate does talk more so about being that leader to make sort of, the LGBT community more accessible and so forth in business, which is very good. And as I was reading that, I was thinking about Tim Cook.
Yeah,
at
me
Apple.
too. That's exactly, yeah.
And the fact that he lived the majority of his life without being open about about being gay, which I think is very interesting, that he only recently, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, changed course. So lots to like about this candidate. Graham, I'll bounce it back to you.
Yeah, I thought this was pretty inspiring actually to read. And I know we've been kind of waxing poetic about all these ApplyWire entries that come in, but it really was a pretty interesting story. And yeah, there's a lot to like here. I had a couple of, I guess there's three things that jumped out at me in terms of potential concerns. One was the candidate referenced retaking the GMAT exam. And, and I haven't seen the breakdown on the 730, but I assume, it's hard to flunk one of the sections and still have a 730. So I'm assuming that the test score is fine. And it did strike me as, given the fuzziness around their goals, my first thought was, spend more time like thinking about what are you going to do after consulting? How's it going to dovetail with military, LGBT, or whatever it might be in their past that can kind of be a thread that they weave through into the future? And also spend that time, like you said, reaching out to the veterans clubs or LGBT clubs at these campuses and getting to know people, because I think that may actually go a lot longer way than, going from a 730 to a 740 or 750. I just wasn't as concerned about the test score. The last thing I was going to say, and I think this actually relates to the goals, is that, there are different sort of types of candidate out there in the pool. And one of the types, as we've kind of pointed out here, is military, right? So, and we said schools tend to like military candidates because of the leadership, the teamwork, and the kind of formative experiences they've had. There are some downsides to being military. And I would say that sometimes there's a concern on the part of the school, like, is this candidate too rigid to kind of, come back into sort of civilian life, because there are differences. Obviously the military is incredibly hierarchical and today's workforce is less and less that way. So there's sometimes concerns about candidates' ability to kind of make that transition into a non-military setting. And even sometimes schools are worried about whether or not employers are concerned about that, and whether candidates can make a smooth transition into the workforce from military and B school. So I think obviously the best way to kind of keep schools from worrying about all that is to have kind of clear goals and to sort of know the path that you might want to take, and so that's why. And I'll just throw this out there, but a lot of military folks end up in leadership positions, but also The one field that seems to really gather them together in quite abundance is operations and logistics and things like that. So clearly going to a McKinsey or any of the strategy consulting firms and getting involved in a number of like operations focused projects or, logistics, whatever it might be, and then indicating that they want to move on and work, in that kind of a capacity as a CEO, COO and then CEO eventually for a Fortune 500 company or a manufacturer or something. That would make a lot of sense to me. And I don't want to put goals in this candidate's mouth, but they should think this through, right? And come up with a plan. Otherwise, it could feel like they just, they're kind of using the MBA to pivot out of what they're in, but don't have a really clear plan for what that's going to lead to. So that's my only critique. And I would spend time doing that instead of retaking the test.
Yeah, I think those are great points, Graham. And like we've said, same with the first candidate, absolutely potentially very strong candidate. But the goals, I think, the long-term goal needs more focus. And I think you hit the nail on the head, connecting that with his or her military experience.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to Applywire entry number 3. So our third kind of guest on the show is someone who has a 740 on the GMAT, a 366 GPA. They've been working for 6 years. They're located in Salt Lake City, Utah, and post-MBA would be happy to end up kind of anywhere in the U.S. They don't really know exactly what their post-MBA career is going to look like, and in the pre-MBA career, they've been thus far doing kind of a sales role, account management, territory management, and they mentioned that in the notes that they're working for the largest engine manufacturer in the world, and kind of managing a sales territory. They do some volunteer work at the Utah Museum of Natural History in the marketing department of that organization. This person actually went to undergrad in the Philadelphia area, graduated cum laude, and finance graduate of the year. President of a student-managed investment fund. They've done the CFA level 1. So there are a lot of details here. They've also mentioned that they kind of have lived all around the U.S. And their goal, which they elaborate on better here in the notes, is to transition into a kind of customer experience, sales management, or marketing management role at a company in automation or sustainability, or with a customer focus on mining raw materials. Or manufacturing. So they kind of have a lot of ideas here. And the last thing they mentioned that I thought was kind of interesting is that they've lived around the U.S., as I said, but they've also lived in some pretty economically devastated areas like Southern Appalachia and coal country. So just, and they mentioned they're male, white, anything else. Target schools are Carnegie Mellon, Dartmouth, Duke, Michigan, and Darden. So I'll let you have at it. What do you think of this person?
Again, like our other candidates, this person has a real potential upside, I think. The experience is different, which can play very well in admissions. So sales experience, B2B sales, selling in engineering, manufacturing, you imagine these are large sales, quite complex sales. And sales process. So probably some very interesting experience that the candidate has that not a lot of other candidates are bringing to the table. So I think that's very good. The candidate, like you said, has lived in some very interesting parts of the country. Graduated from I'm assuming a non-target undergraduate program in terms of sort of I don't think this person graduated from Wharton.
No, it says local Philadelphia University. So I'm assuming it's like, Temple, Drexel, maybe St. Joe's, one of those, yeah.
Which is perfectly fine. The interesting thing about if you're graduating from, let's say, a non-Ivy sort of non-target program, your opportunities coming directly out of school are different, at a different level than your opportunities if you're graduating Ivy or some of these other top programs that feed directly into management consulting, investment banking. So the question then becomes, how does a person take advantage of his or her opportunities coming out of these programs? And I'd say this person has done very well. And so forth. So from that perspective, I think a very interesting candidate. I think I was quite interested on why he or she volunteered at the Natural History Museum in Utah. So that just seemed like a bit of a different thing that they were doing. Obviously, it's an opportunity for them in Salt Lake City. Their post-MBA location, anywhere in the US, I almost giggled when I saw that. Is that anywhere in the US other than Salt Lake City, or does that include Salt Lake City too? But hopefully it includes Salt Lake City too, but I can get a bit cynical about that.
Hard to say.
But I think that what this person needs to do, almost like our other two candidates, these long-term goals need better development, or certainly our previous military candidate. I think at this point, this person's goals are based on direct experiences that he or she's had and is weighing one or two different things. But I think you can make a really good case for one or two of these goals that they've mentioned in the notes. For instance, sort of mining raw materials, very interesting. They've obviously had exposure to that, and obviously that's a very topical issue right now with global warming and various other elements. So if you're potentially planning to go into that at a sustainable level, and you have a plan to do that, that sort of idea, I would imagine, would play very well this upcoming season in MBA admission. So I would really try to focus on those goals. And I forget, and I didn't write it down in my notes, but potentially going into, again, maybe a management consulting directly after the MBA to then move on to pursue these goals would be the way to do that. So overall, I think quite an interesting candidate. I also think if the candidate does square away his or her long-term goals, they might consider one or two additional programs to target. So the programs they've targeted, very good programs, top 16 programs for the most part, and so forth, but maybe a couple of M7s could be added to the mix. And I'll turn it back to you, Graham.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The notes that I had on this candidate were kind of aim higher. And I felt like, and I just want to say for our listeners who are from Utah that, Alex is from England, and so he doesn't always appreciate all the finer aspects of the United States. And we have actually a colleague who lived in Utah and Salt Lake City for a while, and I bet Alex can tell you a little bit more about it. Her name also is Alex. So
yes,
but and I've been out there and been skiing and such. So there are attributes. But anyway, I think that this candidate, I feel like I wrote aim higher in my notes here, and I think I was just thinking about like you said, if they went to a non-target type undergrad and they ended up in kind of a sales role, but they've been moving all around the U.S., gaining in responsibility. And like you said, they probably had some amazing kind of real life, real on the job experiences that would be of great value in classroom discussion. I was actually thinking about even, they mentioned this kind of experience in coal country in Appalachia, and man, that could make for some pretty interesting, essay fodder or even just in class discussion. So I feel like there's a lot to like. I wanted to hear about 3 or 4 target firms from this candidate and like what the role would be for them exactly, because I think, if they could, whether it's getting into consulting and working with, kind of manufacturers and then making a move kind of similar to what we described with the military candidate into a kind of COO or that type of role, that'd be one thing. But maybe they've already identified some sustainable, companies pursuing kind of sustainable mining of raw materials or something, in that domain. And so I just want more specificity because, this candidate isn't on a kind of traditional feeder path. And I feel like when someone's a little non-traditional, ticking the boxes when it comes to like, this is my post-MBA plan can be of great value to the candidate, because it shows the admissions team that, okay, this isn't the type of candidate we see every day, but they have a good head on their shoulders. They know why they want the MBA. They know what they're going to do with it. And oh, by the way, the companies they're targeting are companies that, we typically place people at. So in any event, I think it's, again, another interesting candidate. Obviously, we really appreciate this guy posting, and all of you who are posting, and we'd love to have more time to get to everyone's entries. So let's look at our last one, Alex.
I just wanted to add one more thing, Graham, to this. I think it's really important because we've mentioned the same thing on the last two candidates, our military guy and the sales guy here, about having long-term goals and having some focus. Don't try to make it up. Don't try to think, all right, the admissions committee really wants me to be this kind of person, so I'm going to tell them that. And draft my essays around whatever it is that you're making up. So, and I say this, so if this particular person isn't particularly passionate about, let's say, sustainable, raw material mining in a sustainable fashion and various other things, still try to find what it is you're passionate about for your long-term goal. That then plays well in admissions. You really do need to be passionate about this stuff if you want to be the candidate that stands out, that the admissions readers really sort of have that aha moment and really sort of resonate with the candidate. So don't just do it from lip service, trying to figure out what the schools want to hear, but really dig deep yourself, think long and hard, and try to target what it is that you are truly passionate about and where this MBA is going to take you long term.
Great advice. So with that, we will move on to our kind of fourth candidate for the podcast today and our final one. And this candidate has a 3.5 GPA, 3.51, 4 years of work experience, located in New York, would love to stay there post-MBA. Currently working in a hedge fund and looking to get into investment banking. They listed a whole bunch of targets, Evercore, Houlihan Lokey, Guggenheim, Jefferies, PWP, and again, wanting to start school in 2020. And the target schools list is Cornell, Georgetown, Notre Dame, NYU Stern, Toronto, which is Rotman, and then UNC, Keenan-Flagler. And there was no test score listed, but they mentioned that, in the notes, they said, I'm looking to move into restructuring investment banking, and my GRE estimate at this point is 310 to 320. Still working on it, hoping to be ready for round 1 or round 2. And they also indicated that they are a white male. So what's your take, Alex?
Again, interesting candidate. One of the reasons why we've highlighted this candidate is this candidate has to be highlighted in Wiretap. So major props for that.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Yes.
Again, if you want to be featured in Wiretaps to get some direct feedback from Graham and I, then if you write that in your post to Apply Wire, then I'm sure we can accommodate. Anyway. Much like the other three candidates, some really interesting stuff here. Division 1 athletics captain at school, that's obviously something that sort of stands out a little bit. Combined with the 3.51 GPA, I think that's probably pretty good because oftentimes athletes have time constraints and so forth. So they obviously navigated their undergraduate quite successfully. There were, however, some things that sort of surprised me a little bit by this candidate. And I say surprise rather than anything else. And I kind of like to get your take on this, Graham. The person's estimate for the GRE I felt was low. For someone that's working for a hedge fund or in a finance capacity and so forth, I thought the estimate was low. So I don't know if the person hasn't done a lot of preparation, has just sort of taken some quick practice tests or whatever. And I mean, what this person needs to realize is you really do need to prepare really hard for these tests because other candidates are doing the same, and that's who you're sort of competing with. So I felt the estimate was low, 310 to 320. This person really needs to be in that early 320s, I think, for these target programs. And moving from hedge fund to investment banking was a little surprising. the candidate then backed that up by saying they'd found a niche in finance that they wanted to pursue in investment banking. But I did find that surprising, and I say that as a potential issue because if I find these things surprising, then an admissions reader will find these things surprising. So if they're not really well explained, then it's going to potentially raise a red flag. So making sure that the career path and the goals is well explained, and not forgetting you need to explain it to someone that's not intimately familiar with your industry. So whilst you're applying to business school, you can't assume all the adcom that's reading your file is intimately familiar with not only the hedge fund sort of side of it, but also the investment banking side of it. So make sure that's all well explained. So those were the two issues that I had, Graham.
Yeah, and I think, and this is not meant as any kind of offense to, admissions officers, but I think if you were to ask admissions officers to explain the intricacies and differences, between hedge funds, private equity, investment banking, sales and trading, I don't know, how well they would do on a test about that stuff, right? Because that's not their job really, right? Their job is to just look at, people, what kind of talent they can bring into the MBA program. But so great advice in terms of always, explaining things in a way that the layperson will understand. At least the very smart layperson, I would say. It doesn't have to be, for dummies. But the thing, I think the thing that jumped out at me, well, there are a few things, and I got some answers when the candidate actually responded to some of the comments back and forth on ApplyWire. But, I was kind of like, the GRE estimate seemed a bit low. But I was also just sort of wondering why someone working at a hedge fund who wants to get into investment banking was focused on the GRE as the test they were going to take. And that's not to say that, you can take whatever test you want. Most of the business schools take either GMAT or GRE at this point. But the GMAT is the exam that's kind of traditionally been the business school test, right? So it just sort of struck me. And I thought, what's going on? And so I did ask, and the person said, oh, that's because I want to keep the JD MBA option open. And so, I thought, oh gosh, I know that law schools, or some of them, are now taking the GRE instead of the LSAT. So I guess you could argue that the GRE is this kind of middle ground that the person's hoping to take so that they can apply it to both of those degrees if they choose to apply joint. But then that got me thinking about a lot of other things. So I actually, I did a little homework for the podcast when we decided we were going to talk about this person. And I looked into, what schools are taking, the GRE for law school. And there are a handful. It's actually a growing number, just like with MBA admissions, right? The only difference is that the averages for those people getting into like Georgetown Law or Cornell or, a lot of the top schools on this guy's list, NYU, the average GREs are really high. They're pretty off the charts. They're kind of closer to 330 or high 320s. So they're even higher than like what the B schools might be looking for. So I just wanted to mention that because I think if this person's serious about doing the joint degree, that then even more reason to kind of push the numbers up while they're prepping and try to get best score they can. The other thing that jumped out at me is if they could get that high of a score, then part of me wondered, well, where's like Penn or Harvard on this list, both of which have great joint JD MBA offerings and could be an interesting fit. So that's, obviously time will tell. We'll have to see how they do on the test and that sort of thing. But I think, that's just something that jumped out at me. The other thing, and this might be, maybe I'm giving too much advice here and overstepping, but part of me wondered, why do they need both degrees? And obviously, I didn't give the guy a chance to kind of answer that, and maybe he'll respond in ApplyWire and give us even more info. But I sort of wondered, this is a lot of coin to drop for the 2 degrees, and it's a lot of time. And I wondered, what is it about this type of investment banking they want to do that would make the law degree, that would kind of make it necessary? Because it is a really different path, and it's quite competitive too. So I'm just thinking about, if they want to maximize their chances to get in, what's the best path here and what's best for their career. So those were things that jumped out at me on this guy.
And the other thing about that, though, Graham, is the poster said, I quote, taking the GRE to keep the JD MBA option open.
Right.
So they're not even signaling to me that they absolutely are applying to the joint degree, dual degree, or whatever the right term is. But they're considering that down the road they might end up going to law school, or they might choose a dual degree program now. And again, this goes back to making sure you have good focus through the applications for your MBA program. If you're going to apply to dual degree, go all in, make it clear that that's what you're planning to do. If you're not, don't address it. But you don't want to be someone that's saying, well, I've got to, I'm thinking of doing X, Y, maybe Z, and, it depends how things go. You want to be someone that has a really well thought out plan. Admissions officers like that. Someone with a well thought out plan will make the most of their MBA experience. That's what drives why business schools want people that have thought through this very well before they enter their schools, because programs there's so much going on when you get to an MBA program that having a concrete plan first is best. So don't be signaling you're keeping various options open. Make sure in the applications that you've nailed what your plan is, and does it include a joint degree or dual degree, or does it not? I think is something that you want to clear up first.
Yeah, I would even argue that before you go to like fairs, or when you're interacting with the school, like ideally you've already kind of made the decision about that path. I mean, you might ask questions about it, but so I think having some more focus would help this person.
Yeah, and we're still in the summertime, so it's quite natural that at this point you're weighing up some stuff. But certainly as we move into the season, hopefully that piece of it's cleared up. Graham does make a very good point about the ultimate GRE score. If you do end up getting in that mid 320s, with everything else in this profile, you could be looking at more, a few more schools either in that sort of M7 top 16 bracket, a little bit more competitive. I mean, the schools that you've listed are very good schools for sure, but you certainly don't want to under target yourself if you have an opportunity. They want to be in New York, right, Graham? So I mean, obviously, if they've included Stern, but I mean, if they hit the GRE out of the ballpark, they should probably include Columbia too, right?
Yeah, that's good advice. And I feel like one thing I want to just step back and say is that we love the fact that you all are posting on the site and interacting with one another and giving people, giving each other advice. We love giving you advice as well. And our hope in featuring some of the entries on this podcast is to just provide constructive criticism. And so by all means, it is the summertime. It's perfectly normal that someone might be sort of thinking, well, maybe JDMB, I'm not sure. And so we don't mean to pick that apart and like poke fun. It's more when you get closer to application time, you got to obviously make that decision and know what you want and why you'd want the dual degree if that's the path that you're taking. So, for example, if this area of investment banking that this guy wants to go into is, I think he mentioned restructuring, is particularly, legal intensive, then, there could be a case made and he could have all kinds of reasons as to why to do it. So, but just knowing that, is really important. And again, we want you guys to be, just give us the raw materials and what you're thinking, and we'll try to help you piece it together and give you advice. Alex, anything else on this guy? I think that's kind of the end of our featured wiretap, entries for this week. I did want to talk just briefly about MBA Livewire. I don't know what you've been seeing over there, or whether you have anything else on this last ApplyWire entry before we move on.
Yeah, no, I like I say, I think we've covered all the main issues. Again, this candidate has a lot of upside. I love the fact that he was a Division One captain in college. Obviously, I don't know the sport, but whilst maintaining a very strong GPA, that plays well in business school admissions because in the MBA program, you're going to be super busy and you need to be able to maintain a very strong academic record. So this person has proven that already. So there is some really nice stuff here, just some things to tighten up. And obviously, the ultimate success of this candidate is going to be based on how well they do in this particular test score. To sort of cap things off, and not to say that the only thing that business schools are interested in is a test score. There couldn't be anything further from the truth. But if the test score ultimately becomes a candidate's weakest aspect of their candidacy, And if this candidate came in with a 310 GRE, I'd argue it probably would be the weakest aspect of the person's candidacy. Then if it's the weakest aspect, it is the most important aspect. That's the reality of a holistic admissions process.
Yeah, agree. So we are going to sign off. We're running out of time, but I did want to mention that there's been some activity on Livewire, and I think like the theme of this summer on Livewire has been there've been a lot of posts of people saying, "Hey, anyone hear anything about the wait list at school X?" And then there've been a lot of posts with people saying, "I just got in off the wait list," or "I just got a phone call from the school," or an email. And a lot of these emails are kind of to the effect of, "Are you still interested?" To call a spade a spade, I would say it's kind of like, if we were to accept you, are you going to come? And so there's a lot of that happening. And sometimes it's done via phone, sometimes it's done via email. But even schools like Wharton are sending out emails, saying, "Hey, we just want to make sure, are you still interested? And would you be able to like quit your job and get here in a couple weeks if you get an offer?" And so I think, schools are really finding themselves needing to go to the list late in the game. And that's a somewhat unusual. I mean, it happens every year, but I feel like it's in greater number this year. I know just, there are a lot of admissions folks who have experienced a lot of what we would call melt. So you pick your class, you get everyone signed up, and then it melts away a little bit. You lose some people who get in off a wait list and so on. So we're seeing schools do this, and I think some of it is just practical. Like they want to, they don't want to waste any time admitting someone and going through all the motions if that person can't come. But I think some of it's also a little bit strategic or tactical, if you ask me. So I don't know what your take is on that, and if you know what I mean by that. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, just to be very brief, I think. Schools are more so going to their summer wait list this season than they have in the past, which is symptomatic of the applicant pool being a little bit down this year. And I think we've seen other evidences of that with the analyses that we've done. But it does surprise me, some of these tactics so late. And the emails that are being sent out by schools, and those, not that the content necessarily is being shared, but the fact that the emails being received and being discussed. I think sometimes schools aren't as aware of that, the discussion aspect, as they should be. The other thing I just bring up real quick, Graham, I know we're running out of time. We got a really interesting entry on Decision Wire actually overnight. A US-based candidate selecting to go to London Business School, whilst they also had an offer at Harvard. And their rationale was they wanted more global exposure during their MBA program. So I thought this can be a good decision. I think it's quite a courageous decision, because no doubt many people would have been advising this candidate to go to Harvard. Harvard's outstanding by any measure. But to not select Harvard, and you've been through this process yourself, Graham, not to select Harvard, to select another school, I think, that isn't called Stanford, I suppose, but to select another school, I think it can be quite a courageous decision. So kudos to that person on Decision Wire.
Yeah, it is interesting. In talking to European schools, they often, mention that, gosh, America always talks about being, offering a global business education, but when you look at the student body, it's not really, these schools are touting like maybe 30, 40 or 45% international at best. And it's, when you look at obviously places like INSEAD or LBS, it's like there's no one nationality that has more than a few people in the classroom at any time, right? So yeah, very different experience. And I would say if the UK wasn't going through Brexit, I would say, very logical decision. I think that, you can make arguments that there's a lot of instability in both markets, the US and the UK, because of immigration and political stuff and everything. But in any event, yeah, interesting entry. I hadn't seen that come in overnight. So thanks for sharing that. And we'll be back in a week's time with a whole other set of entries to discuss. So please continue to post to the wires. And as Alex said, let us know if you want us to talk about your candidacy. Eventually I'd love to do one of these like live and get people to actually, call in or do a show somewhere in person and have some candidates sit down and chat with us. So we'll work towards that, but we need your ratings and support to get there. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be back in a week's time. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. And thank you very much, Graham.
All right, take care.
Cheers.